Good morning. My name is David Stanek, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. As Diane said, I've been working with Tillman for about the past year. And as an outside observer of Egypt and a relative newcomer to the city of Cairo, I've always been interested to find out what has happened. And I think this is a narrative that a lot of us who may be observing the city from afar, is we see a very large city with an incredible amount of people and traffic and pollution. And it's overwhelming. And then oftentimes we see cities like this and we call them megacities as some kind of exception. And indeed it is an exceptional city in many ways. But unfortunately this kind of dialogue blurs the actual issues on the ground, and it enforces some ideas about planning that everything can somehow be fixed through some rational solutions. So one of the things that I'd like to, there's a couple things, my overview is I'd like to, first I'm going to talk about the production of space and the production of space in Cairo, and the policies and approaches of the production of that space in Egypt since Nasser. I'm going to ignore the time before Nasser, and I hope you forgive me for that, but we're going to keep this brief. And then I'm going to show you quickly the development of Cairo from 1965 through 2013. And then I'm going to talk about the changes in the approach to 2011, since 2011, to planning and city building and the production of space. So the production of space. This is a concept of space developed by Henri Lefebvre. And he pretends that space is a relationship of three things. The first is perceived space. Perceived are what you see here: buildings, trees, streets, the number of people in the space. It's what you can describe. It's the traffic. It's the amount of money that flows through a city, the economy, the things that are measured, the people that go along a street, the width of the street, the height of the buildings, the density, the intensity of development, the height, the width. And so this is the realm in which planners and decision makers about how to produce space typically function. They say, look, we need to measure things and figure out how this is all going to work. And then they come up with ideas. And this is the second part of Lefebvre's paradigm, is this idea of conceived space, which exists in your mind. It's the ideas, the maps, the plans, and the drawings. And oftentimes this is where the conflict of planning and development of space happens. You have an idea of what you'd like to do with your community, and I have an idea of what I'd like to do. There are many things I'd like to do with this room, but somebody who's more important than me says, no, you can't do that. And so this is where conflict happens oftentimes when we're dealing with the production of space. But there's a third component that is often ignored by planners and decision makers, especially in Egypt and many, many other places. This is not a critique of just Egyptian planners, but of planning across the globe, is that they ignore what's called lived space. Lived space is life. It's what happens in the urban spaces. It's the experience of the people. It's the history of the environment and the culture. It's the families, it's the settlements, it's the relationships of inclusiveness and exclusiveness. It's the idea of what's happened in a place and the memories that reside there. And that this idea that the built environment and what is there is intimately linked with society. And as we all know, the experiences of Egypt over the past 3 years, these spaces have been hyper-intensified with these memories and these cultures and these experiences. And the conflict over these spaces are evident in the graffiti, in the protest, and the redefinition of public spaces by different actors. And so we just have to remember this, that society is linked to your city spaces and to urban development. And that if you're going to try and change the urban development, you're always going to change society as well. And so the choices that are made about development have impacts on the way society functions. So, a very brief history about the production of space in Cairo, and this is specifically the state's approach. And so we start with Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt from 1956. When Nasser came into power, he had these ideas of making Egypt great again in a post-colonial era. And there was an era of modernization and industrialization which had major impacts on the spatial layout of the country. He adopted a high modernist planning paradigm which privileged technocratic approaches to planning and used developments such as the Aswan High Dam to show the pride of Egypt and the power of the state. And there was also the rise of the technocrat. Egypt privileged these, again, this was the rational, efficient approach to planning and to create these plans and ideas that were above reproach by politicians. So, under Anwar Sadat and Hosni Mubarak in the 1970s and 80s, there was this idea and a common understanding that Cairo was too dense, and it was too big, and there were too many problems. And in 1965, there's about 4.6 million people in Cairo, and they have to redistribute the city. And so in the 1970s, Sadat adopted the new cities paradigm, which is the expansion and redistribution of the population from Cairo to the east-west corridor into the desert. There was also the Infitah, the opening of Egypt to global capitalism, which radically reshaped the economy of Egypt, which also had massive implications for the development of space. And then there was the desert land speculation. With the prospect of land, with the new cities initiatives, everybody wanted a piece of that action, the real estate development. And so public land in these desert areas were sold off to investors and then controlled by them. And then in the 1990s and 2000 was the neoliberal era, the structural adjustment policies of the World Bank, the post-Gulf War of 1991, the real estate boom that happened in Egypt, and the intensification of crony capitalism. So what happened? So very quickly, this is the greater Cairo region. For those of you unfamiliar with the greater Cairo region, Tahrir Square is around here, the pyramids are around here, this is the Malik here. The new cities that I spoke about on the east-west corridor are around here. New Cairo, the new American University in Cairo is around here, and all of this is new development in the 6th of October city over here. So 1965, population about 4.6 million people. 1999, now we're up to 14.5 million people. Now what I've done with this satellite image, Egypt is not this green. I've intensified the colors so you can see the contrast. But the bright green is the farmland, and the dark areas is the urban space. And just 14 years later, this is Cairo, with approximately 20 million people in the greater Cairo region. So, what's the change? What's happened here? There's two major thrusts. One is the loss of farmland to the urban expansion, which you can see in yellow. And the second is the policy driven of the east-west expansion. So how did these things expand? So we had the proliferation of informal settlements. Cairo is an informal city. About 66% of the people live in informal settlements. I already mentioned the expansion of the formal and exclusionary developments in the desert. What happened was the intention was to move the population to these deserts, but unfortunately, they had to be planned. They were more expensive than what most people in Cairo could afford. And so and also due to the real estate speculation, the people who owned that property only wanted the best of development that could happen. And then we also had the urban core deterioration, and then what's called Gulfanization, is the idea, the imported models from Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Saudi Arabia along the Nile Corniche area. So here we have a map that shows the informal and the formal areas of Cairo. And as you can see, the red areas are the informal areas. Much of that is expansion into the arable land. And the formal areas are the areas that are legal. And this is what a typical informal settlement might look like. And these are all over Cairo. Now to remember that the informal settlements, there's different varying degrees. So sometimes we think of informal settlements as slums, but you're talking about 66% of the population living in these areas. So this is a middle class phenomenon as well. And so, yes, there are very poor and very deteriorated areas that are shacks and slums, but the majority of them are not. There are definitely low standards of housing, and some of these places are very dangerous because they're developed outside of the purview of the government, and so they're not subject to the laws and regulation. And then we have the expansion into the desert here, And this is the type of the development, the formal development that happens. This is the City of Sciences in the 6th of October city. This is a development called Madinati, which means my city, which is a high-end development close to Sharuk city on the outskirts of Cairo. And then this is a development, October City, developed by Mountain View Real Estate. And you can see the type of consumer that these types of developments are targeting, not your typical Egyptian. And so this is the interior, this is the old core of Cairo. As the investments have been made in the desert parts of the city, the interior has deteriorated greatly. And this also gives the government the excuse that, oh, as they let these places deteriorate, then they have the excuse to say, these are unsafe, they must get rid of them. And then we have the development along the Nile and the prime real estate in the inner city of this high-end Gulfinization development. So there was this revolution in 2011. And what has changed in the planning paradigms, in the development paradigm since then? So this is the Cairo 2050 plan, which started being released around 2009. It was readopted by the Morsi government and is still in play. This was developed by Gamal Mubarak and a team of his closest friends and investors. And you can see that the ideas are relatively consistent from the 1970s. This, in case you didn't notice all the arrows, means redistribution and expansion of the city east and west. And so this is the continued investment to the east and west corridors. And still, the development of the Nile Corniche. This is, again, the conceived space. This is somebody's idea of what might happen with the Nile. Now, I'm not trying to say that Egyptians can't dream about a city like this. That's not the thing. Here's the issue, is that oftentimes that the planners and decision makers are thinking about a global Cairo. It's a great idea, and there's the world city phenomenon that's come across the globe. We have Mumbai, we have Jakarta, we have New York, we have Paris, we have London, and Cairo wants to be a part of that. But what about a local Cairo? This is where we come in, but we're not starting this. This is an old game in Cairo. People have been clamoring for some voice in the decision-making processes in Cairo, in the production of space in Egypt for a long time. And I'm not trying to pretend that I can tell you how the revolution started or why it happened. There's smarter people who have written books and books about this. But is it something to do with this space? And so there's an idea that drives some of our work called The Right to the City, also developed by Henri Lefebvre. It's a simple idea. At its basic form, it's simply that people who live in the city, the inhabitants of any space, should have a right to have a part in the decision-making processes that develop that space. And so, with that, these are people who were in Tahrir Square asking for some space in the decision-making of their country. Thank you very much.